Okay, so looking at this is what I had. I had restorative justice practices, our favorite word that we've all heard so many times. And I think that the key here is to understand that this provided the framework in order to understand the main reasoning behind it. So just a quick little graphic on what is restorative justice, what are practices. So if you notice over on the left side, they have like the darker colored red and it goes into a lighter red. This is basically like the concept of how things are done effectively. So it starts off with addressing and discussing the needs of the school community, and then you have to build and invest in those relationships. And I think the key word in that second bubble is educators. You can't just assume that the students are going to be super receptive when they see teachers modeling apprehension or the lack of buy-in for restorative justice. It's also noted that in the notes, restorative justice was referred to as RJ. So just so that way you're understanding that if I reference RJ or if it's referenced in the notes, it just means restorative justice. The goal is to just reduce, prevent, and improve harmful behavior, and then also resolve the conflict and hold everybody accountable. A lot of times restorative justice practices get a negative connotation because it can be seen as too lax on a student or too lax on the offender. And a lot of people want that eye for an eye. They want the idea of so-and-so stole something, so, punishment should be suspension, expulsion, and that further perpetuates that school to prison pipeline if we are not identifying, okay, let's bring the parties together and let's talk about this. So looking at the next key points, restorative justice takes a foundation of education and knowledge for staff and administrators. You can't just roll this out at the beginning of the year and have one day of PD around what it should look like. Let's practice a circle. All right, let's go. You have to make sure that you're investing in the time it takes and the intentionality behind this. Many times the lack of follow through is what causes the failure of RJ in schools. Speaking from a school who's trying it right now, we're still in the beginning phases. It can be hard, especially when certain teachers don't feel like it's working, so they don't feel like they need to be held accountable. Looking at this chart right here, you'll notice that there's a traditional approach and then the restorative approach, and it should be just looking at accountability. Accountability in a traditional approach is just punishment. They deserve detention. They deserve after school lunch detention. Well, not after school lunch detention, but after school detention, suspension, removing from a classroom. But in the restorative approach, you'll notice that accountability is understanding what happened and how are we moving forward to repair the harm done. It involves the offender, victim, and the school, and they all have roles in that justice process. However, the traditional approach, you ignore the victim. A lot of times, if so-and-so's things get stolen, you're not really communicating with that victim of what that would look like and what do they need in order to feel supported by everyone in the community involved. So looking at that, it should be easy. You could probably even identify, oh, my school right now is definitely in traditional, or, oh, mine is attempting restorative. However, what I'm noticing is the traditional part is still there. Like we're still implementing some things, or like, oh, we're here, but unfortunately, majority is still traditional. Looking at question stems, so restorative justice, a lot of times it involves a restorative circle where both parties are involved and facilitated by the teacher or community members or those who were also impacted and who also have a stake in what was done. So if you look at the left-hand part of the square, when speaking to someone who has caused harm, these are some of the sentence stems you could ask them. So obviously, what happened? What have you thought about since? I think that's a powerful statement because a lot of times when we are talking to students, we don't ask them, like, since this mistake, what have you thought about then? We always like to say we're not defined by mistakes. However, in the education system, certain mistakes set students up to be tracked in certain ways that are not effective and conducive for success. And I also like the question on the left-hand side, that little bubble that says, what do you need to do to make things right? Like holding them accountable to, hey, like what do you think would do to bridge this gap that was suddenly created by decisions made? And also looking at when speaking to someone who was harmed, what have you thought about since, right? Like a lot of times, again, like was said, the victim is ignored, not intentionally. However, we don't really put them at the forefront of conversations. So the questions of what's been the hardest part, what do you think you need, like what needs to be done to make things right, are all effective across all grade levels, right? Like I teach middle school, and some of these sentence stems have been able to allow a child to sit and sort of reflect on, like, what do I need in order to feel supported and included back in the school community, as well as the victim of, like, what do I need in order to feel safe and seen and valued? all of this takes time. This is not something, like I said, beginning of year PD, let's do it for a week. All right, roll it out the first time an infraction occurs. This is big investment. This is big intentional times. On the reading, again, if you looked in the notes, you'll notice that some of the schools, like, they see positive results. Of course, that doesn't happen overnight. And so when thinking of restorative justice, these are some of the things that you for sure need to be thinking of, and intentional with the sentence stems and who's involved and the rationale behind why we do this.